On a quiet spring morning in 1945, a pregnant woman and 5 children ventured into the forests of southern Oregon for a Sunday school picnic. They were searching for the perfect spot when one of the children spotted something unusual: a large, deflated balloon tangled in the trees. As they gathered around to investigate, someone tugged at the strange object. In an instant, a devastating explosion tore through the peaceful forest, killing Elsie Mitchell and all 5 children instantly. They would become the only combat casualties on the American mainland during World War II. Victims of a weapon so audacious, so seemingly impossible, that even today it sounds like science fiction. The Japanese had weaponized the wind itself, launching thousands of bomb-carrying balloons across 6,000 miles of open ocean, using the jet stream as an invisible highway to rain terror on American soil. This is the story of the Fugo Project, one of the most ingenious, desperate, and bizarre weapons ever deployed in warfare. A campaign that succeeded technically while failing strategically, and a reminder that even in our modern age of precision-guided munitions and satellite tracking, some of these paper weapons still lie hidden in American forests, waiting to be discovered. The Empire under siege. To understand why Japan would conceive such an audacious weapon, we need to understand the desperate situation the Empire faced by 1944. The war that had begun with stunning victories at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and across Southeast Asia had turned into a catastrophic nightmare. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the pride of the nation, had been gutted at the Battle of Midway in 1942 and systematically destroyed in subsequent engagements. The combined fleet, which had dominated the Pacific for 2 years, was now a shadow of its former self. By the summer of 1944, American forces were island-hopping across the Pacific, each conquest bringing B-29 Superfortress bombers closer to the Japanese home islands. The strategic bombing campaign that would eventually kill more than 300,000 Japanese civilians was just beginning. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, the great cities of Japan, would soon face nights of fire that would make Sherman's march through Georgia look like a gentle stroll. Japanese military planners faced an impossible problem. How do you strike back at an enemy that is destroying you when you lack the conventional means to reach them? Japan's bomber force couldn't reach America. The few successful submarine missions to American waters had accomplished little. Saboteur teams landed on the West Coast had been quickly captured. The Empire's strategy of creating a defensive perimeter had failed utterly. The perimeter was collapsing, and the Americans were coming. It was in this context of military desperation and national trauma that Japanese scientists and military planners turned their attention skyward, to the mysterious rivers of fast-moving air that had been discovered flowing from west to east across the North Pacific. The discovery of the jet stream. The jet stream, those powerful bands of wind that circle the globe at high altitudes, had been observed by Japanese meteorologists since the 1920s. A meteorologist named Wasaburo Oishi had launched hundreds of weather balloons throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, meticulously tracking their movements and discovering that at altitudes above 30,000 feet, there existed consistently powerful westerly winds. Oishi's work, published in Esperanto in an obscure meteorological journal, had gone largely unnoticed by Western scientists. This gave Japan a significant, if temporary, advantage in understanding these atmospheric phenomena. By the time World War II began, Japanese meteorologists understood that during winter months, a particularly strong and stable jet stream formed over the Pacific, carrying air masses from Japan directly toward North America at speeds that could exceed 200 miles per hour. The military implications were tantalizing. If you could build a device that could ride these winds, You could theoretically deliver a payload to America without needing aircraft carriers, without needing long-range bombers, without needing fuel beyond what was required to fill the balloon with hydrogen. The ocean itself, that vast defensive barrier that had always protected America from Asian powers, could be overcome not by ships, but by wind. Major General Tsuyoshi Kusaba of the Imperial Japanese Army was placed in charge of what would become the Fugo Project, sometimes called Operation Fugo. The name came from fu, meaning wind, and go, a standard military designation. It was a fitting name for a weapon that would literally ride the wind to its target. The parameters were clear. Develop a cheap, mass-producible balloon weapon that could carry incendiary and high-explosive bombs across the Pacific, create panic among American civilians, start massive forest fires in the Pacific Northwest, and ideally, divert American resources away from the Pacific offensive. If the balloons could disrupt American morale, force the deployment of fighter aircraft and military personnel to deal with the threat, and create a sense of vulnerability in the American heartland, they would achieve their purpose even if they caused minimal actual damage. Engineering the Wind Warrior. The Fugo balloon bomb was a marvel of simplicity and sophistication. At first glance, it appeared primitive. A paper balloon filled with hydrogen, carrying a few bombs. But the engineering details revealed a weapon that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with 1940s technology. The envelope of the balloon measured 33 feet in diameter, creating a sphere with a volume of approximately 19,000 cubic feet when fully inflated. This size was not arbitrary. It was the minimum required to lift the payload and control mechanisms to the necessary altitude, while still being small enough to mass-produce efficiently. The paper itself was the result of centuries of Japanese paper-making tradition adapted for modern warfare. Washi paper. Made from the inner bark of kozo, paper mulberry, mitsumada, and gampi trees, had been used for everything from umbrellas to sliding doors to lanterns. The long fibers created a material that was surprisingly strong and flexible, resistant to tearing, and relatively resistant to water when properly treated. But a single sheet of washi would never be strong enough to contain the hydrogen pressure or withstand the stresses of high-altitude flight. The solution was lamination. Multiple layers of washi paper, carefully aligned so that the fibers ran in different directions, bonded together with konnyaku paste made from devil's tongue potato flour. The paste was mixed with water to create a glue that dried flexible, not brittle, crucial for a material that would be subjected to extreme temperature variations. The construction process was painstaking. Workers would lay out sheets of washi on large tables or clean floors, apply the paste with brushes or their hands, then carefully position the next layer. Each seam had to overlap precisely. Any gap, any misalignment, any contamination in the paste could create a weak point that would cause catastrophic failure at altitude. The pressure differential between the inside and outside of the balloon at 30,000 feet was substantial. Any flaw would result in an explosive decompression that would shred the entire envelope. Once the basic envelope was constructed, it had to be tested. Workers would carefully inflate the balloon inside the production facility, examining every square inch for leaks. They would mark any problem areas, deflate the balloon, apply additional layers of paper to reinforce weak spots, then test again. Only after a balloon passed multiple inflation tests would it be approved for the next stage of assembly. The payload assembly was attached to the balloon by a series of sturdy cords that converged on a metal ring. From this ring hung the sophisticated automatic control mechanism, the true innovation that made the Fugo project possible. The altitude control system was essentially a mechanical computer designed to solve a single problem. How do you keep a balloon at a consistent altitude for 3 days without human intervention? The solution involved a battery-powered altimeter connected to a series of blow plugs, essentially electrically triggered releases. The system worked like this. The balloon would launch filled with hydrogen, carrying 32 sandbags arranged around a ring, each weighing approximately 7 pounds. As the hydrogen heated during the day, the balloon would rise. The altimeter monitored the altitude, but during ascent, it did nothing. Rising was fine. But when the gas cooled at night and the balloon began to descend, falling below approximately 30,000 feet, the altimeter would trigger a blow plug, releasing 1 sandbag. The sudden loss of 7 pounds would cause the balloon to rise again, gaining altitude until it reached equilibrium. This cycle would repeat night after night. Japanese engineers calculated that with 32 sandbags, the balloon could maintain altitude for approximately 60 to 80 hours, enough time to cross the Pacific Ocean and reach North America. But the system had to account for the endpoint. After roughly 3 days aloft, most or all of the ballast would be expended. At this point, the control mechanism would begin releasing the bombs. First, it would drop the incendiary devices, each on a small parachute to slow their descent and ensure they exploded above ground, maximizing the spread of fire. Then, it would release the main anti-personnel bomb. Finally, it would trigger a self-destruct charge, a flash bomb designed to ignite any remaining hydrogen and incinerate the paper envelope, preventing the Americans from recovering intact examples for study. The bombs themselves were carefully selected for the mission. The Type 15 incendiary bombs weighed about 11 pounds each and contained a mixture of thermite and magnesium. Upon detonation, they would create an intense, white-hot flame capable of igniting virtually anything combustible. The theory was that if even a fraction of the 9,000 planned balloons reached American forests and successfully deployed their incendiaries, the resulting forest fires would be catastrophic. The single high-explosive bomb carried by each balloon, a 33-pound Type 92 anti-personnel bomb, was intended for a different purpose. This weapon, packed with picric acid, would explode with devastating effect if anyone approached the balloon after it landed. It was essentially a booby trap, designed to kill civilians and military personnel who might investigate the strange object. The entire assembly, balloon, control mechanism, batteries, ballast, and bombs, represented an investment of approximately $300 in 1944 dollars, roughly $5,000 in today's money. Compared to the cost of a bomber aircraft, $600,000 for a B-29, the Fugo was remarkably cheap. Japan calculated that if even 10% of the balloons reached America and caused damage, the program would be cost-effective. The Shadow Factory. While the engineering was sophisticated, the manufacturing process relied on the most basic of resources: human hands. With Japan's industrial capacity stretched to the breaking point, and virtually every able-bodied man either fighting or working in weapons factories, the Fugo project turned to a workforce that had never been associated with weapons production: schoolgirls. The directive went out to schools across Japan. All girls from middle school and high school would be mobilized for war production work. Some would work in conventional factories, making ammunition or aircraft parts. But several thousand would be assigned to balloon production, working in converted theaters, warehouses, and even sumo halls. The largest production facility was established in Tokyo's Nichigeki Music Hall, a grand theater that had once hosted performances and films. Now its spacious main floor served as a clean room for balloon assembly. The work demanded cleanliness. Any dirt or debris that contaminated the paper or paste could compromise the balloon's integrity. The girls, a many as young as 12 or 13, would arrive in shifts. They were required to remove their shoes. The sharp edges and dirt from shoe soles could damage the delicate paper. Many worked in bare feet or cotton socks, sitting on the clean floor for hours at a time. The work was organized with military precision. Teams would be assigned to specific tasks. Some would prepare the konnyaku paste, mixing the powder with water to achieve exactly the right consistency. Too thin and it wouldn't bond properly. Too thick and it would create rigid spots that would crack. Others would cut the washi paper to precise dimensions using sharp knives and following templates. The assembly teams would then lay out the pieces, apply paste, and carefully position each layer. The paste was caustic. It would make their hands red and chapped, causing the skin to crack and bleed after days of constant exposure. Some girls developed allergic reactions, but they were told this was their patriotic duty, their contribution to a weapon that would strike back at the Americans who were destroying their cities, killing their brothers and fathers serving overseas. They worked in silence, forbidden from discussing what they were doing even with each other, certainly not with their families. The Fugo project was classified at the highest levels. Security officers watched constantly. Any girl who spoke about the work faced severe consequences, potentially even arrest and interrogation by the Kempeitai, Japan's feared military police. The psychological burden on these young workers was immense. They knew Japan was losing the war. The evidence was all around them. The B-29s flew over regularly now, often in broad daylight, untouchable by what remained of Japan's air defenses. They saw their cities burning. They knew people who had been killed in the raids. And they were told that these paper balloons, so fragile that you could punch a hole through one with your finger, would somehow turn the tide. Many years later, after the war ended and the truth about the Fugo project emerged, some of these women would speak about their experiences. They described the cognitive dissonance of creating weapons while still being children themselves, of knowing abstractly that these balloons were meant to kill people on the other side of the ocean, but not being able to truly comprehend what that meant. One former worker, interviewed in the 1990s, remembered crying one night after learning about the WWII incident. That a pregnant woman and 5 children had been killed by one of the balloons she might have helped construct. The randomness of it haunted her. These weren't soldiers. They weren't legitimate military targets. They were just people who happened to be in the wrong place when a weapon she had helped build completed its 6,000-mile journey. But in 1944, such reflections were impossible. There was only the work, the paste on their hands, the careful alignment of paper, and the constant pressure to produce more balloons, faster. Production ramped up through the fall of 1944. By November, Japan was producing hundreds of balloons per week, stockpiling them at launch sites along the coast. Launch preparations. The launch sites were carefully selected along Japan's eastern coast, particularly on the main island of Honshu. The locations needed to be near hydrogen production facilities. Filling each balloon required a substantial amount of gas. They also needed to be positioned to take maximum advantage of the winter jet stream, which was strongest and most consistent from November through March. The launch sites themselves were simple affairs. Open areas where balloons could be inflated and released without obstruction. Teams of soldiers would carefully unpack each balloon, inspect it one final time, then begin the inflation process. The hydrogen would be pumped in slowly, the paper gradually expanding until it achieved its full 33-foot diameter. While the balloon inflated, other teams would arm the bombs and install the control mechanism. This was dangerous work. These were live explosives being handled by soldiers who had minimal training. There were accidents. Some balloons exploded during preparation, killing launch crews. But the pressure to continue was immense, and safety concerns were secondary to operational demands. Once a balloon was fully inflated and armed, it would be held down by ground crews waiting for optimal launch conditions. Meteorologists would monitor the upper-level winds, waiting for the jet stream to be in the right position. Launch officers would check the weather forecasts. They wanted clear conditions over Japan, but didn't care much about what the balloon would encounter over the Pacific. The balloon's design should handle storms and turbulence. Then, at the designated moment, the crew would release the tethers. The balloon would rise rapidly, accelerating upward at several hundred feet per minute. Within minutes, it would be a small dot in the sky. Within an hour, it would be invisible, caught in the jet stream and racing eastward at perhaps 150 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. An altitude where no human could survive without pressurization and oxygen. The crews would watch it disappear, knowing they would never learn what became of it. There was no tracking system, no way to follow its path. It was simply gone, released into the wind, and whatever fate awaited it on the other side of the ocean. The first balloons were launched on November 3rd, 1944. Over the following 5 months, Japan would launch approximately 9,000 Fugo balloon bombs. The launches occurred primarily at night to reduce the chance of American reconnaissance aircraft spotting them. Some nights, dozens of balloons would be released from multiple sites along the coast, a silent armada drifting eastward into darkness. The Pacific Crossing. Imagine the journey from the balloon's perspective. Rising rapidly through the cold air over Japan, the ground falling away below, the launch crews shrinking to invisible specks. Higher and higher, until the curvature of the Earth becomes visible, until the air becomes thin and bitterly cold. Temperatures at 30,000 feet regularly drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit or colder. The balloon enters the jet stream, that river of fast-moving air, and suddenly accelerates. Ground speed increases from perhaps 20 miles per hour to 150 or even 200 miles per hour. The balloon is racing eastward now, crossing the Japanese coast and heading out over the vast Pacific Ocean. Night falls. The hydrogen cools and contracts. The balloon begins to descend. The altimeter detects the drop below 30,000 feet and triggers a blow plug. A sandbag falls away, tumbling toward the ocean far below. The balloon rises again, stabilizing at its target altitude. Day breaks. The sun warms the hydrogen. The balloon rises naturally, but this is acceptable. The altimeter only triggers on descent. For hours, it drifts through the crystalline blue sky of the upper atmosphere, a fragile paper sphere suspended in the jet stream. This cycle repeats. Night after night, sandbag after sandbag falls into the Pacific. Some balloons fail. Paper tears from the stress, hydrogen leaks out through imperfect seams, batteries die prematurely, control mechanisms malfunction. These balloons fall into the ocean, their bombs sinking to the bottom, their mission failures. But many survive. The paper, for all its seeming fragility, proves remarkably durable. The konnyaku paste flexes with the temperature changes rather than cracking. The control mechanism, for all its mechanical simplicity, works. Hour after hour, mile after mile, the balloons continue eastward. Some encounter storms, massive Pacific weather systems with violent turbulence and icing conditions. Some balloons are torn apart. Others somehow survive, battered but intact, emerging from the storm clouds to continue their journey. The randomness is total. There is no skill involved, no piloting, no adjustment for conditions. Each balloon is entirely at the mercy of the atmosphere. After approximately 3 days, 60 to 80 hours. The survivors approached the coast of North America. Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, California. The western edge of the continent comes into view, though of course the balloons have no cameras, no way of recording their accomplishment. They are simply objects following the laws of physics, driven by wind and controlled by simple mechanical systems. The control mechanism begins its final sequence. The last sandbag has been released, or enough time has elapsed that the system determines it's time to deploy weapons. The incendiary bombs drop first, their small parachutes slowing their descent. Then the main anti-personnel bomb releases. Finally, the self-destruct charge triggers, or doesn't, as many malfunctioned. Some balloons successfully destroy themselves, the flash bomb igniting the remaining hydrogen in a brief fireball. The paper envelope consumed by flames. Others fail to self-destruct, drifting down intact or partially intact to land in forests, on mountainsides, in lakes, on farmland, in backyards. The journey that seemed impossible, crossing 6,000 miles of ocean using nothing but wind power, has been completed. The world's first intercontinental weapon has reached its target. The question now is, what happens next? The American response. The first confirmed Fugo balloon to reach North America was spotted on November 4, 1944, by a U.S. Navy patrol vessel off San Pedro, California. Sailors recovered the deflated balloon from the water, mystified by its construction. It was clearly Japanese. The markings and paper type made that obvious. But how had it gotten there? The balloon was sent to Naval Intelligence for analysis. Within days, more reports came in. A rancher in Montana found strange debris in his field, paper fragments, metal fittings he didn't recognize. A forest ranger in Oregon spotted something caught in trees. Military personnel at various Western installations reported unusual findings. The military's initial response was confusion, bordering on panic. Was this some kind of biological weapon delivery system? Were Japanese submarines lurking off the coast, launching these things? Were there aircraft carriers they hadn't detected? The idea that these balloons were simply floating across the Pacific on wind currents seemed too fantastic, too technologically implausible. But scientists brought in to examine recovered balloons began piecing together the truth. Geologists analyzed the sand in the ballast bags, identifying its unique mineral composition. The sand contained microscopic marine organisms called diatoms, and the specific species present narrowed the origin to beaches along the Japanese coast. Meteorologists confirmed that yes, there were powerful upper-level winds that could carry objects from Japan to North America. The realization was startling. Japan had successfully created an intercontinental weapon. They were attacking the American mainland. The military response was multifaceted. Fighter squadrons were put on alert to intercept any balloons spotted in flight. Anti-aircraft batteries were instructed to engage, if possible. This proved largely ineffective. The balloons flew too high for most fighters to intercept effectively, and they were difficult to spot in the vast western skies. More successful was the ground response. The military organized teams to search for and recover balloon debris. Bomb disposal experts were trained on how to safely neutralize the explosive devices. Forest rangers, police officers, and military personnel across the western states and Canada were briefed on what to look for and what to do if they found balloon fragments. But the most important element of the American response wasn't military. It was informational. Government officials quickly realized that the balloon's effectiveness depended partly on psychological impact. If Americans knew that Japanese weapons were falling from the sky across the western states, If newspapers ran stories about forest fires and explosions caused by balloon bombs, if panic spread through civilian populations, then the Fugo campaign would achieve much of its purpose, regardless of actual damage caused. The solution was unprecedented: a total media blackout. The Office of Censorship, working with newspaper editors and radio broadcasters across the nation, issued a directive. Absolutely no mention of balloon bombs would be allowed in the press. No stories about strange objects found in forests, no reports of explosions, no speculation about Japanese weapons reaching America. It was a remarkable display of media cooperation. In an era before the internet, before social media, when information flowed through centralized channels, it was actually possible to suppress a story like this. Journalists who discovered balloon incidents were told the story was classified for national security reasons. Editors agreed not to publish. Even when 6 people died at WWII, a major news story under normal circumstances, the media stayed silent on the details. The blackout served another crucial purpose. It denied Japan any intelligence about whether their weapons were succeeding. Japanese agents listening to American radio broadcasts heard nothing. Japanese intelligence officers reviewing American newspapers found no mentions. From Tokyo's perspective, the balloons were disappearing into silence. No confirmation of hits, no reports of damage, no evidence of panic. This information denial would prove to be one of the most effective weapons against the Fugo campaign. The geography of silent war. Between November 1944 and April 1945, the Fugo balloon bombs scattered across North America in a pattern that revealed both the power of the jet stream and the fundamental weakness of the weapon system. The balloons landed in 17 U.S. states, plus territories in Canada and even Mexico. The confirmed finds stretched from Alaska in the north to Mexico in the south, from California in the west to Michigan in the east. The northernmost finds were in Alaska, where balloons landed in remote wilderness areas, discovered weeks or months later by hunters or prospectors. Some Alaskan balloons were never found. They likely landed in areas so remote, so inhospitable, that human beings simply never encountered them. The westernmost concentrations were in Washington, Oregon, and California, exactly where Japanese planners expected. The forests of the Pacific Northwest, with their massive stands of old-growth timber, were supposed to become infernos when the incendiary bombs detonated. But there was a critical flaw in the timing. The balloons launched during winter and early spring, when these forests were wet from rain and snow. The thermite bombs would spark and burn, but they couldn't ignite the damp vegetation around them. If Japan had waited until August or September, the height of fire season in the American West, the results could have been catastrophic. Hundreds of thermite bombs igniting simultaneously across the driest forests in America, with limited firefighting resources available during wartime, could have created a disaster. But Japan couldn't wait. By August 1945, there would be no Japan left to launch balloons from. Some balloons traveled extraordinarily far. One reached Farmington, Michigan, nearly 5,000 miles from the launch sites. Another landed near Thermopolis, Wyoming. Several reached Kansas and Nebraska. The randomness of their distribution created significant challenges for recovery efforts. There was no pattern, no predictability. A balloon could land anywhere. Most landings occurred in remote wilderness areas, which from one perspective was fortunate. The bombs exploded or landed harmlessly far from civilian populations. But this also meant that many balloons were never found. They landed in deep forests, in mountain valleys, on remote plateaus where no human would travel for years or decades. The ones that landed near populated areas often created brief scares. A rancher would find strange debris and call the sheriff. The sheriff would call the military. A bomb disposal team would be dispatched, often traveling hundreds of miles to reach the site. They would carefully examine the device, render it safe, and collect the fragments for intelligence analysis. Some balloons landed in more sensitive locations. The incident at Hanford, Washington, was particularly concerning. A balloon struck a power line feeding the plutonium production facility, part of the Manhattan Project. The line went dead, cutting power to the reactors. Backup systems immediately kicked in, preventing a catastrophic meltdown of the cooling systems. The outage lasted only briefly, but military planners were shaken. If a balloon could accidentally disrupt America's nuclear weapons program, what else might they hit by chance? Another balloon landed near a railroad track in Montana. The anti-personnel bomb exploded when a track maintenance worker investigated it. But miraculously, the man survived with only minor injuries. Several balloons landed on military installations, causing temporary scares before being neutralized. But for the most part, the balloons were simply nuisances, strange, unsettling reminders that America's geographic isolation could be breached, but not effective weapons in any tactical sense. The vast emptiness of the American West swallowed them up. In a nation spanning millions of square miles with huge regions of uninhabited wilderness, the balloons were needles in a continental-sized haystack. The WWII tragedy. When theory became horror. Reverend Archie Mitchell was 30 years old in the spring of 1945, serving as the pastor of the Christian and Missionary Alliance Church in Bly, Oregon, a tiny logging community in the southern part of the state. His wife Elsie, 26 years old and 5 months pregnant, was beloved by the congregation. They had planned a pleasant Sunday outing, a fishing trip and picnic on Gearhart Mountain with 5 children from the Sunday school. The children were excited. Joan Patsky, 13, was a bright, cheerful girl who loved music and had a beautiful singing voice. Her younger brother Dick Patsky, 14, was protective of his sister and looking forward to the outdoor adventure. Edward Engen, 13, was described by those who knew him as curious and intelligent. Sherman Shoemaker, 11, was the youngest, thrilled to be included with the older kids. Jay Gifford, 13, rounded out the group. It was May 5th, 1945. In Europe, the war was effectively over. Germany would surrender 3 days later. In the Pacific, American forces were preparing for the invasion of Okinawa. The war seemed distant from the peaceful forests of southern Oregon, a world away from the carnage of combat. The group drove to Gearhart Mountain, about 10 miles from Bly. Archie got out to scout ahead for the best spot to set up their picnic. Elsie and the 5 children stayed near the car, exploring the area. The forest was beautiful. Towering pines, clear air, the sounds of birds and wind in the trees. Then one of the children called out. They had found something unusual. A large balloon, partially deflated, tangled in the trees. It had Japanese markings on it. Curious, they gathered around. Joan or Elsie, accounts vary on exactly who, reached out to touch it. Archie, some distance away, heard Elsie's voice. "Look what I found, dear." Then, immediately, an explosion. He ran back to find all 6 people dead or dying. The balloon's anti-personnel bomb had detonated, designed to do exactly what it did, kill anyone who approached. Shrapnel had torn through all of them. Elsie Mitchell died instantly. All 5 children died instantly or within minutes. Archie Mitchell found himself suddenly, inexplicably alone, his wife and their unborn child gone. 5 children he was responsible for dead, and no way to process what had just happened. One moment they were laughing and exploring. The next, they were casualties of a war that was supposed to be thousands of miles away. He drove back to Bly in shock, barely able to explain what happened. Military authorities arrived quickly. They identified the balloon fragments. It was a Fugo bomb, one of the few that had failed to self-destruct. The explosives were still fully armed when the group found it, waiting for 3 months in the forest for someone to disturb it. The military immediately realized they had a problem. They could no longer maintain the media blackout. People needed to know these things were out there. On May 22, 1945, the Office of Censorship lifted the ban on balloon bomb stories. Newspapers across the western states ran warnings. If you find a suspicious object, a strange balloon, anything unusual in the forest, do not touch it. Call the authorities immediately. But the warning came too late for Elsie Mitchell and the 5 children. They became, and remain to this day, the only combat casualties on the American mainland during World War II. 6 lives lost to a weapon that traveled 6,000 miles to kill them essentially at random. The psychological impact on Archie Mitchell was devastating and permanent. He eventually remarried and continued his ministry work, but those who knew him said he never fully recovered from that day. How could he? One moment of curiosity, one innocent discovery, and everyone he cared most about was gone. The irony was crushing. The balloon that killed them had been launched in February 1945, 3 months before the incident. It had traveled across the Pacific, survived storms and temperature extremes, landed without exploding, and waited. If they had walked a different path, if they had chosen a different day for their picnic, if they had found it an hour earlier or later, they would have lived. But warfare is indiscriminate, and the Fugo balloon bombs were perhaps the most indiscriminate weapons ever deployed, literally drifting at random until chance brought them to their targets. The campaign's end and the silence that killed it. By April 1945, balloon launches from Japan had ceased. The program was terminated after just 5 months of operation, despite having achieved the seemingly impossible goal of reaching America with a simple paper weapon. The reason for cancellation was straightforward. As far as Japanese intelligence could determine, the campaign was a complete failure. They had launched 9,000 balloons into the void and received no confirmation that any had reached their target. Japanese agents monitoring American radio broadcasts heard nothing about balloon bombs, forest fires, or explosions. Japanese intelligence officers reviewing captured American newspapers found no mentions. There were no reports of panic, no emergency military deployments, no indication that the Fugo project was having any effect whatsoever. From Tokyo's perspective, they were wasting precious resources on a weapon that didn't work. The hydrogen alone represented a significant investment. Hydrogen production required electricity and industrial capacity that Japan could barely spare. The paper, the paste, the labor, the explosives, all were desperately needed elsewhere as American forces closed in on the home islands. In reality, the Fugo campaign had been remarkably successful in its technical objectives. Somewhere between 300 and 1,000 balloons had reached North America. They had scattered across 17 states and Canada. They had killed 6 people. They had forced the American military to deploy fighter squadrons, organize bomb disposal teams, and conduct extensive search operations across millions of square miles. The balloons had demonstrated that America's geographic isolation could be breached by even relatively primitive weapons. But none of this information reached Japan, and so they concluded their innovative weapon was a failure. The American media blackout, that unprecedented act of information control, had won the balloon bomb war far more effectively than any military response could have. There's a tragic irony here. If Japan had known their balloons were reaching America, they might have continued and even intensified the campaign. They might have launched balloons through the summer, when forest fires would have been catastrophic. They might have modified the weapons based on intelligence about where balloons were landing. The very success of the Fugo project remained secret from the people who created it, leading directly to its cancellation. One has to wonder what the schoolgirls making balloons in Tokyo thought when production stopped. Did they know why? Were they told the program was successful but being replaced by other priorities? Or were they simply reassigned to other war work without explanation? For most of them, the truth about what their balloons had accomplished wouldn't emerge until after the war ended, when American occupation forces revealed the full story. The technical legacy. Setting aside the human tragedy and moral questions, the Fugo balloon bombs represented a significant technical achievement that influenced post-war military thinking and meteorological science. From a purely engineering perspective, the balloons proved that intercontinental warfare was possible without sophisticated guidance systems or propulsion. They demonstrated that automation could replace human control for certain types of missions. The altitude control mechanism, primitive as it was, showed that machines could make decisions based on environmental inputs, a precursor to the much more sophisticated automated systems that would follow in the missile age. The meteorological knowledge required to execute the campaign was cutting edge. Japanese scientists' understanding of the jet stream was ahead of Western knowledge at the time. And the Fugo investigation forced American meteorologists to rapidly advance their own understanding of high-altitude wind patterns. This knowledge would prove crucial for high-altitude bombing campaigns, for developing weather forecasting models, and eventually for planning commercial aviation routes. After the war, American scientists carefully studied recovered balloon fragments and interviewed Japanese engineers who had designed the system. They were impressed by the elegance of the design, how simple components were combined to create a relatively sophisticated, automated weapon. The reports they generated influenced American thinking about guided missiles, drones, and other unmanned weapon systems that would emerge during the Cold War. The concept of using environmental forces, wind, ocean currents, gravity, as free energy for weapon delivery was not forgotten. During the Cold War, both American and Soviet planners explored balloon-based reconnaissance systems. Project Genetrix, an American program in the 1950s, used high-altitude balloons to conduct photographic reconnaissance over the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. While these were not weapons, they used the same basic principle as